I helped a stranger carry her bags home. What happened next changed my life forever. I'd been on the road 3 days, standing in my driveway in the late afternoon, hosing the dust off my rig, when I saw her across the street, new neighbor, arms full of grocery bags, one of those brown paper ones splitting down the seam, oranges bouncing off the steps into the flower bed. The light was thick and golden, and the asphalt smelled of heat. I crossed the street. I carried her bags up to the door. She turned in the doorway, the light behind her, and smiled up at me, and something I thought had died a long time ago just breathed. My name's Dean Sutton. I'm 34. I drive a truck for a living long haul, mostly the Interstate 80 corridor out of Roseville, California. If you've ever passed a big rig on the grade east of Sacramento at 4 in the morning, running dark and steady with the whole world asleep around it, there's a decent chance that was me behind the wheel, one hand on the shifter, coffee going cold in the cup holder, the radio turned down to almost nothing. I've been doing this most of my adult life. My father did it before me. It's the kind of work that suits a certain type of man, and I suppose I'm that type. You're alone a lot. You get comfortable with your own thoughts, or you learn to be, because there's nobody out there on that highway at 3 in the morning to have them for you. The diesel hums up through the floor and into your bones until you can't tell where the engine stops and you begin. Headlights come and go, mile markers count down, and you drive. I live alone now. I want to be honest about that from the start, because it matters to the rest of this. The house I come home to is quiet in a way that goes past peaceful and lands somewhere closer to empty. Half the refrigerator is bare. There's one chair at the kitchen table I never sit in, and I couldn't tell you exactly why I keep it there. Maybe just so the table doesn't look like it gave up too. For a long stretch of years, I took the longer runs on purpose. 9 days out instead of 5. The lane nobody else wanted. Over the mountains in winter. I told my dispatcher it was for the miles, and the miles were real. But the truth underneath the truth was simpler. When you're moving, the silence has somewhere to go. It streams out behind you at 70 miles an hour, and you don't have to hold it. It's only when you stop, standing in your own kitchen with the engine finally off, and the house not making a sound, that the quiet catches up and sits down across from you. My father raised me on that highway, more or less. He kept a street Christopher medal hanging from the mirror of every rig he ever drove street. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, a little brass disc worn smooth as a river stone from 40 years of his thumb rubbing it before he pulled out of a yard. When I got my own first truck, he took it down from his mirror, pressed it into my hand, and closed my fingers around it. "For safe travels," he said. It got the two of us a lot of miles. I hung it from my own mirror the same day. It rode with me everywhere for years. But mine's been gone a while now. I'll get to that. I was married once, too. Brooke. We met young, married younger, and for a few years I honestly believed we'd figured something out that most people never do. She was loud in the way that felt like life. At first she filled a room, filled the quiet, and after a childhood of long hauls and longer silences, I thought loud was the same thing as warm. It isn't. I learned the difference the slow way. When the company I drove for got bought out, they restructured the whole operation. The premium long-haul lanes I'd built my paycheck on got cut, reassigned, handed to a computer that didn't care how many years I'd been clean and on time. My income dropped. I picked up work with a smaller outfit and kept us afloat. But afloat wasn't the life Brooke had signed up for, and she said so, often, and at volume. When the money got thin, so did she. The divorce went through when I was 31. No kids. Brooke used to say I loved that truck more than her. Truth is, the truck never once asked me to be someone I'm not. So that's who I was, standing in my driveway with a garden hose that afternoon. A quiet man in a quiet house, 34 years old, good at leaving and out of practice at everything else. I'd made a kind of peace with it. I really thought I had. Then a paper bag split across the street, and I set down the hose without thinking twice. Her name was Cara Dunmore. She'd moved into the little rented house directly across from mine, the one with the good front porch that had sat empty most of the winter, and by the time I'd gathered the last runaway orange out of her marigolds, and stacked her bags on the step. She'd told me that much, and I'd told her my name back, and that was the whole of it. Or I thought it was. She was quiet. That's the first thing I noticed, and coming from me, that's not a small thing to notice. Not shy. Exactly, she looked me right in the eye when she thanked me, but quiet the way still water is quiet. Like there was a lot going on down under the surface that she wasn't in any hurry to show you. After years of Brooke, who narrated every feeling she'd ever had at full volume, there was something about that stillness I couldn't stop turning over in my head on my next run east. We became neighbors in the slow, ordinary way people do. She'd wave when I pulled out before dawn. I'd nod when I got back. Then one evening, I noticed the porch light beside her door was flickering, the fixture hanging loose off 2 strip screws, and the next morning before my run I brought over my drill and a couple of anchors and fixed it, because it was a 10-minute job and it bothered me to see it hanging like that. She came out while I was up on the little stepladder and stood at the bottom, holding a glass of iced tea for me, shading her eyes against the sun, and she watched my hands work the screwdriver with a kind of attention I didn't understand and didn't question. After that, something settled between us. When I got in late off a Hall 9:10 at night, road tired down to the teeth, there'd be a plate on my porch under a dish towel. A real dinner. Pot roast. Once. Still faintly warm. A note tucked under the edge in careful handwriting. Figured you wouldn't feel like cooking. See, I'd stand there in the dark on my own steps holding a warm plate a near stranger had made me, and I'd feel something in my chest I didn't have a name for and wasn't ready to go looking for one. There were other evenings that spring, too. She'd knock with half a pie she'd made too much of, or I'd come home to find she'd swept the winter's dead leaves off my porch steps while I was gone. We got into the habit of sitting out on one porch or the other as the light went down, not saying much, just listening to the crickets start up in the dark. The smell of warm bread would drift out through her screen door. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was the best part of every week I had, and I didn't examine that too closely either. I started coming home a little more, taking the 5-day lanes instead of the 9. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things that spring, and I believed almost none of them, and I kept telling them anyway. A man doesn't rearrange his whole working life around a plate of warm pot roast, unless something in him has already decided something the rest of him hasn't caught up to. There were things about her I couldn't explain, if I'd stopped to line them up. But I didn't stop. That's the thing about being handed something good after a long drought. You don't interrogate it, you just drink. The coffee was the first one. She had me over one Saturday morning, and before I could say a word she set a mug down in front of me, black, and said, "No sugar, right?" And she was right. I take it black. No sugar. Always have. I remember thinking, in a distant, pleased sort of way, that she must have guessed, or maybe I'd mentioned it and forgotten. People guess. I let it go. Then there was the night I was talking about the mountains. We were on her porch, the crickets going in the dark, and I was telling some long dumb story about the worst weather I'd ever driven through, and I said the word Donner Pass, in the grade over the Sierra where the snow comes sideways, and the chains go on and you white-knuckle it down praying your brakes hold, and she went still. Just for a second. Her hand stopped on her cup, and her eyes went bright and wet in the porch light, and then she blinked it back and asked me something about the coffee, changing the subject so smoothly, I almost didn't catch it. I did catch it, but I filed it under some private grief of hers I had no right to poke at, and I let that go too. The tightest one I got from Della. Della Prentice, the widow 4 doors down who'd lived on that street since before I bought my place, and knew everything that happened on it before it finished happening. She caught me at the curb one evening while I was rolling out my trash bins, and she nodded across at Kara's lit windows and lowered her voice like she was letting me in on something. "That sweet girl," she said. "You know." She asked me which house was yours. Before she'd even signed her lease, stood right where you're standing, and asked me, real careful, which one was Dean Sutton's. Isn't that something? And I laughed. I actually laughed, and said something about how it was a small street and everybody ended up knowing everybody, and Della gave me a long look over the top of her glasses like she was disappointed in how slow I was being, and let it drop. I wheeled my cans back up the drive and didn't think about it again for a week. I want to stop here and tell you something, because if you're listening to this, you can probably already see what I couldn't. You've got all the pieces laid out on the table in front of you, and you're maybe a little ahead of me, wanting to lean in and say, "Dean, come on, the coffee, the pass, the girl who asked which house was yours." I know. Believe me, I know now. But I want you to understand what it's like to be the man inside the story instead of the one watching it. When you've spent years training yourself not to hope for anything, you get very, very good at not seeing the thing right in front of you that might make you hope. It's not stupidity, it's armor, and mine was on tight. There was one more. The last one before everything came apart, and it's the one I think about most. She'd had me in for coffee again, and while she was in the kitchen I stood by her front door, and there was her key ring hanging on a little hook on the wall by the coats. House key, car key, a couple of others, and hanging off the ring, catching the light, a small brass medal, worn smooth, the raised figure on it rubbed almost flat. Street Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. Something moved in my chest when I saw it. A little tug, low and strange, like a hand had reached into me and pulled a thread I'd forgotten was even attached to anything. My heart just knocked once, hard, for no reason I could name, and I stood there, a second longer than made sense, looking at a stranger's key ring, feeling like I'd almost caught the tail end of a dream. Then she came back in with the coffee, and I turned away from the door, and I let that go too. God help me, I let it go. You always look at my hands when I talk about the road. I said to her once, later, half teasing, because I'd caught her at it more than once, watching my hands like they were telling a second story on top of the one my mouth was telling. She smiled down at her coffee. She didn't look up. "Maybe," she said, "I'm just glad they came home safe." I thought it was a sweet thing to say. That's all. I thought it was a sweet, neighborly thing to say to a man who drove for a living, and I let it warm me, and I let it go. I didn't hear what was underneath it. I couldn't. Not yet. It was Brooke who finally made me look. Which, if you knew Brooke, is about the cruelest joke the universe could have set up, because Brooke has never in her life made anyone look at anything except her. She showed up on a Sunday. I hadn't seen her in more than 2 years, and there she was in my driveway, leaning against a car I didn't recognize, sunglasses pushed up in her hair, looking me over like she was appraising a house she used to own, and might buy back. Word gets around, I guess. Somebody had told somebody that Dean Sutton seemed to be doing all right these days, seemed lighter, seemed like maybe there was somebody across the street, and Brooke had always had a nose for other people's good fortune and a talent for showing up in the middle of it. "You look good," she said, which from her was never a gift, only an opening. She talked in a wide circle for a while how she'd been thinking about me, how she'd driven past the old house, how big and quiet it must feel with just me rattling around in it. She let her eyes go to Kara's place across the street more than once. She'd already clocked it. Brooke could read a street the way I could read a weather report coming over the Sierra, and she had read this one in about 4 seconds flat. I should have shut the door. I know that now. But there's an old groove worn into you by someone you were once married to, and even years later a part of you drops right back into it before your good sense can catch up. So I stood there. And I let her talk. She went away that day with nothing but the shape of an idea, and I should have known she'd be back once she'd sharpened it into something she could use. She came back 3 days later, and this time she'd done her homework, and this time she wasn't smiling. She caught me in the driveway again, in the evening, and she had something in her hand, and she was holding it the way you hold a winning card. It was a business card, one of mine, old, soft at the corners, the ink a little faded. Sutton Hauling, it said, with my name and a phone number and, at the bottom, the Roseville address. One of the cards I used to hand out years back when I ran the occasional job under my own name. Brooke still had a little stack of them in a box of my things she'd never gotten around to returning. "You want to know something about your little neighbor?" Brooke said. "You're quiet, girl." I told her to leave it alone. She didn't leave it alone. She never once, in all the years I knew her, left anything alone. "You used to hand these out at every truck stop on the 80. she said, holding the card up between two fingers. So here's what I can't make add up any other way. I got talking to that busybody down the block, Della, and you know what she told me? Your girl asked which house was yours before she ever signed her lease. By name, Dean. Before. She picked this street. She picked the house across from you. On purpose. So you tell me, how does a woman like that even know a man like you exists? Unless she went looking? She's got one of these in a drawer somewhere. I'd bet the house on it. The evening had gone that flat gray it goes right before dark, and her cheap, heavy perfume was filling up the space between us, and the old card made a dry little scraping sound as she flicked it against her thumbnail, and I stood there and felt something cold start to spread through my chest. She researched you, Brooke said, low and certain, driving it in. She kept your card for years. She moved in across the street on purpose, and she's been playing sweet neighbor and leaving little dinners on your porch, and you've been eating it up like a stray. That's not a coincidence, Dean. That's a woman running a play. And she almost looked sorry for me, which was worse than anything. You're the mark. And here's the thing I'm least proud of in this whole story. It worked. It worked, because she'd taken things that were real. Kara did keep the card. Kara did ask Della. Kara did choose that house on purpose. Every word of it was true, and she'd poured poison over all of it, until the truth itself looked like a trap. That's the terrible trick of it, and Brooke was an artist at it. She didn't have to lie to me. She just had to take a good thing and hold it up in bad light, and let my own fear do the rest of the work for her. And my fear was more than happy to help. I went back over everything that night, and now every piece I'd let go of came back wearing a different face. The coffee she knew without asking. The way she went still at the word Donner, the medal on her key ring. Her hands, always watching my hands. It had felt like being seen, and I hadn't even known how badly I'd been missing that until she gave it to me. Now, standing in my dark kitchen with Brooke's voice still crawling around in my ear, it felt like being watched instead, like being handled, like being studied and worked and set up, and I couldn't tell anymore which version was real, and not being able to tell was its own kind of sickness. I lay awake that whole night, doing the worst kind of math, moving every kind thing she'd ever done for me out of the column marked kindness and into the column marked evidence. By morning I'd half-talked myself into believing a good woman was running a con, and the awful part was how little push it took. I got quiet. Quieter than usual, and that's saying something. When Kara waved the next morning, I lifted 2 fingers off the wheel and pulled out fast. When a plate showed up on my porch that week, I left it there until the food went cold, and then I set it, washed and empty, on her step without a note. I answered her in short words across the driveway, and found reasons to be busy. I told myself I was being careful, smart, protecting myself. That's what I called it, and it sounded almost reasonable, the way most cowardice does. She knew. Of course she knew. You can't be as watchful as that woman was and not feel the temperature drop. I'd catch her at her window in the evening, looking across at my house, and the porch light I'd fixed with my own hands would be burning bright over her head, and she'd have her hand halfway up, like she was going to come over, going to knock, going to say something, and then she wouldn't. She'd let her hand fall, and she'd turn off the light and go in, and I'd lie awake on the other side of the street hating how sure I'd let myself become. There was a strip of grass and asphalt maybe 40 feet wide between her front door and mine. All spring I'd been crossing it without a thought in the world. Now it sat there in the dark between us like something too wide to get across, and for the first time since the day she moved in, I looked at Kara Dunmore's door, and I didn't cross the street. She crossed it instead. It was a few nights later, and it had started to rain, that soft, steady spring rain that comes down warm and patient and doesn't seem to be in any hurry to stop. I heard her knock, and I knew it was her before I opened the door, and part of me wanted to leave it shut. I opened it anyway. She was standing on my step in the rain without an umbrella, wet through, and she didn't try to come in. She just looked at me and said, "I think you already know, and I think you deserve to hear it from me and not from her." I let her in. She stood dripping in my kitchen under the one light I had on, and she didn't deny a single thing. That's what got me first, before any of the rest. She didn't argue. She didn't spin it. She set the whole truth down on my kitchen table between us like she'd been carrying it a long way and was finally allowed to put it down. 7 years ago, she said, in February, I was driving over Donner Pass in the middle of a snowstorm at night, and the kitchen went very quiet. She'd been coming back from her mother's funeral, she told me. 24 years old, no money, a job in California she couldn't afford to lose waiting for her on the other side of those mountains, and everything she owned in the trunk of a car that had seen better days. And on the worst grade, in the worst of it, a tire blew. She'd pulled onto the shoulder with the snow coming sideways, and her phone dead in her hand, and no idea how she was going to live through the night, let alone the rest of it. And she'd sat there in the dark and the cold, and honestly, she said, given up. Just for a minute, she'd sat there and given up. And then a truck pulled in behind her, hazards flashing through the snow, and a driver climbed down and knocked on her window and asked if she was all right. I don't remember it. That's the part that matters. I have stopped for a lot of stranded cars over the years. It's just what you do out there. It's the code. You don't leave somebody sitting broken down in weather that can kill them. I've changed tires in the rain and the snow and the dark more times than I could count, for people whose faces washed out of my memory before I'd made the next state line. To me, it was a Tuesday. To her, it was the night her whole life turned on a hinge. She told me the driver changed her tire in the snow, gave her coffee from a thermos, hot, and made her drink it before she'd stop shaking, told her to pull out behind him and follow his taillights down the grade, and he'd go slow, and he wouldn't lose her, and he didn't. And at the bottom, at the truck stop where the road finally flattened out and she was safe, before he pulled away, he'd reached up and taken something down from his mirror and pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it. For safe travels, she said, saying my father's words back to me in my own kitchen, and I felt the floor tilt. That's what he said, and then he gave me a card, in case the tire didn't hold, so I'd have a number to call. And he drove off. And I never even got his name straight in my head. I was shaking so hard. But I kept the card. And I kept this. She reached into her coat pocket, and she set it on the table between us. A small brass medal, worn smooth, the figure on it rubbed almost flat. Street Christopher, patron saint of travelers. I always meant to give it back, she said. I picked it up. My hands weren't quite steady. I turned it over. And there on the back, faint under my thumb, worn but there, were 2 letters scratched into the brass a lifetime ago. D.S., my father's initials, and mine, and it came back. All of it, all at once, the storm, the grade, the little compact car on the shoulder with its hazards dying, the young woman shaking too hard to hold a cup of coffee. I remembered her. 7 years late, standing in my kitchen in the rain, I finally remembered her face. I didn't come here to trap you, Dean, she said, and her voice was steady even though her eyes weren't. You were the one kind thing on the worst night of my life, and I spent 7 years too scared to say thank you. That's all moving here ever was. That was the whole plan, just getting close enough, working up the nerve. I know how it looks. I know what she showed you. I'm sorry it looks like more than it is. And I stood there, with my father's medal warm in my palm, and I understood, finally, the difference between what Brooke had done and what Kara had done. Brooke had taken something good and held it up in bad light to make it ugly. Kara had taken the worst night of her life and spent 7 years turning it into gratitude, and then found the courage to walk across a street in the rain and hand me the truth with both hands. One of those is a trap. The other is the bravest, most honest thing anyone has ever done for me. The rain came down steady on the roof. The metal was warm. I reached across the table and pushed it gently back toward her. Keep it, I said. It clearly knew the way home before I did. And whatever door Brooke had been standing in for 2 years, I closed it, quietly and for good. And I didn't feel a thing but relief. We took it slow after that. We had to. You don't undo 7 years of one person's silent hoping and one man's practiced not hoping in a single rainy night, and neither of us tried to. What we did instead was small and steady and real, which, it turns out, is the only kind of thing that lasts. It started with coffee on her porch in the mornings before my runs. Then it was both porches, depending on the light. She'd have a mug ready when I came down my steps in the dark, black, no sugar, and I finally understood how she'd known that the first day she'd watched a man drink truck stop coffee at the bottom of a mountain 7 years ago, and never once forgotten a single thing about him. I started leaving a little earlier, just so there'd be time to stand in her kitchen a minute before I went, and some mornings that minute stretched out longer than it should have, and I let it, and I didn't mind being late. I learned things about her the honest way now, out loud, a piece at a time, that she'd rebuilt her whole life after that winter and made it into something good. She worked as an in-home physical therapist, spent her days helping people learn to walk again, use their hands again, trust their own bodies again after an injury or an illness, knocked the certainty out of them. Patient, quiet work, done with those steady hands I'd caught her using to watch mine. It made a kind of sense I couldn't have explained. Of course, she'd built a life out of helping people get back on their feet. Somebody had once stopped for her in the snow, and she'd spent the rest of her life passing it on, and I learned to leave a light on. That sounds like nothing. It was the hardest thing I did all year. For a man who'd spent a decade making sure the house was as dark and empty as he felt, learning to leave the porch light burning because somebody might look across and want to know I was home, that took real work. But I did it. I'd pull out at 4 in the morning and glance in the mirror, and there'd be my own light on behind me, and hers on across the street, 2 little squares of yellow in the dark, and I'd drive off into the mountains feeling less alone than I had in years. It wasn't dramatic, any of it. There was no single evening you could point to and say, that was the night everything changed. It was 100 small evenings instead. It was her learning which nights I'd be too tired to talk, and just sitting with me anyway. It was me learning the sound of her key in her own door across the street, and finding that I listened for it. It was the slow, almost invisible work of 2 careful people deciding, a little at a time, to stop being careful with each other. I'd spent my whole life believing the big things arrived all at once. She taught me they don't. They arrive the way spring does over the valley, so gradually you don't notice until one morning you look up and everything's already in bloom. Somewhere in there I did a quiet thing I never told her about until it was done. On my next long run through Reno, I stopped at a truck stop I knew, and I bought a Street Christopher medal. New, bright. The figure still sharp. Nothing like the worn one, but the same saint watching the same road. And I hung it from the mirror of my rig, in the spot that had sat empty for 7 years, ever since I'd taken the old one down on a snowy grade and given it away to a stranger, without knowing I'd be spending the rest of my life trying to find her again. She noticed it the first time she climbed up into the cab. She reached out and touched it, set it swinging, and looked at me. And she didn't have to say anything. But I said it anyway. Now we both travel safe, I said. She kept the old one, worn smooth, on her key ring by the door, where I'd first seen it, and felt that strange tug, and turned away. I carried the new one over every mountain. Same saint, watching both ends of the same road. The other thing that changed was the road itself. A dedicated regional lane opened up out of the yard, shorter runs, home most nights, less money but a good deal less highway, and I put in for it, and I got it. I'd spent years taking the longest hauls I could find, so the silence would have somewhere to go. I didn't need the silence to go anywhere anymore. I needed to be home by dark, so I took the local lane, the one that put me back on my own street most evenings, and if the pay was a little thinner, well, there was somebody at the other end of the day now, and that math worked out just fine. About a year on the following spring, the almond trees going white all over the valley, I came in late one night through a storm, not the Sierra, just a hard valley rain, but enough to slow the whole freeway to a crawl, and I was 2 hours past when I'd said I'd be back, road-tired and wet, and cursing the wipers the whole way in. I came up my street expecting both houses dark. Hers wasn't. The porch light I'd fixed with a drill and 2 anchors the first week I knew her was burning bright through the rain, and she was sitting up behind the window with a book, waiting, the way you wait for someone you've decided to wait for. And I sat in my cab a minute at the curb, engine ticking as it cooled, the new metal still swinging a little from the mirror. And I looked at that light, and I thought about that 40 feet of grass and asphalt that had once sat between our doors like something too wide to cross. It wasn't too wide anymore. It was just the walk home. I made it every night. Della saw the whole thing happen, start to finish, from her porch 4 doors down, and she never once let me forget that she'd called it before I had a clue. That spring, she was out in her chair when I pulled in one evening and Kara came down the steps to meet me, and Della waved and called out across the yards. Told you. She had. She'd told me from the very start, standing at the curb by my trash cans, and I'd laughed it off. I didn't laugh now. I just waved back and took the walk across the street, the one I never got tired of taking. I'm telling you all this from the far side of it, now that I know how it goes. Now that I know the shape of the whole thing the way you only ever know it looking back. For most of my life, I believed the important things came at you loud. That love announced itself, that the moments that changed you showed up marked and obvious, so you couldn't miss them. I had that exactly backwards. The night that changed everything. I drove away from it, thinking it was nothing, just a stranded car, just a Tuesday, just the code, just what you do. I forgot her face inside a year, and she carried that nothing of mine like a lantern through 7 years of her life, and then walked it back across a street in the rain and handed it to me. I thought I was just a guy carrying groceries for a neighbor. Turns out I'd been carried too for 7 years, by a stranger I'd forgotten and a small brass medal I gave away in a snowstorm. I helped her carry her bags home. She'd been carrying me home the whole time. So let me leave you with 2 questions tonight, and I mean them. Have you ever done a small kindness you completely forgot about, something so ordinary to you that it fell right out of your memory that meant absolutely everything to somebody else? And if a stranger crossed the street to help you today, no strings, no reason would you let them? If this story moved you, do me a favor, hit that like button. Subscribe, because I've got more stories like this one coming. And tell me down in the comments what's the smallest kindness that ever changed your life. I read everyone. I'll see you on the next one. Drive safe out there.